response to Re-Ravindra9689, henceforth known to be as Ravi, so I don't have to say that continuously, and his video addressing William Lane Craig called Infinite Assumptions. Now right off the bat, I want to admit that when it comes to divine eternality, there are several views that can work depending on your views of time, divine simplicity, omnipotence, omniscience, necessity, etc. It will be my purpose in this paper to merely offer options that work in describing God's relation to time in the world, but that is all. I do not claim to agree with some or all of these views, rather I am claiming that these views hold solid arguments and have solid arguments behind them. Now having said this, Ravi perceives two problems with the properties of spacelessness and timelessness. I'll take a look at each of these briefly in turn. First, Ravi attacks the idea of divine temporality by suggesting that if we define spacelessness as immaterial and timelessness as eternal, then we undercut the very nature of God when we espouse that infinity cannot actually exist. Ravi states, quote, "If God is eternal and eternality is defined as an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of time cannot be transversed, then you trap yourself in your own argument. God is still a sentient being, and as such he would have an infinite amount of actions, thoughts, and decisions to make prior to the making of the universe. Therefore, he would never have arrived at the thought, nor made the decision, nor gone through with the actual action of actually creating the universe because an infinite amount of time cannot be transversed," end quote. Let me briefly make two considerations. First, there's a difference between an actual and a potential infinite. An actual infinite is a collection of definite and discrete members whose number is greater than any natural number, or put differently, is a set considered as a complicated totality with an actual infinite number of members. For example, you could consider the grains on a beach, and the beach continues forever and ever. A potential infinity is a collection that increases towards infinity as a limit but never gets there. For example, any finite distance can be subdivided into parts for a potential infinite. This distinction is important for the philosophical arguments argue against an actual infinite and not a potential infinite. A theist then could argue that God's thoughts, actions, and ultimately his will are part of a potential infinite and not an actual infinite, and thus we escape the objection raised by Ravi. Second, it is important to understand the mathematical notion of an actual infinite is a quantitative concept, meaning that it concerns itself with the collection of definite and discrete elements that are members of a collection. However, when a theist speaks of the infinity of God, they are not using the term to indicate a mathematical understanding of the word to indicate an infinite number of elements within the being of God. Rather, the term is used in a qualitative sense. In other words, infinity is understood to indicate metaphysical necessity, moral perfection, omniscience, omnipotence, etc. None of these attributes need to involve an infinite number of things. For example, omnipotence is not defined as the ability to do an infinite amount of things, but rather in terms of actualizing states of affairs. According to Craig, quote, "As such, it involves no commitment to an actual infinity of things. Therefore, there's no reason to think that God is susceptible to the sort of quantitative analysis imagined by the objections. Thus, denying that God is actually infinite in the quantitative sense in no way implies that God is finite. This inference does not follow, since the quantitative sense of infinity may be simply inapplicable to God. Hence, we have a second solution to the objection raised by Ravi. Second, Ravi attacks the idea of divine timelessness by suggesting that if we define spacelessness and timelessness as existing outside of space and time, then, quote, "you might as well say that he does not exist." Ravi goes on to state, quote, "To say that God is spaceless and timeless is to say that he occupies no space and no points in time. Rather, one can say that he is nowhere never. For something to exist, it must exist in space and time, somewhere in some point in time. Otherwise, one can say that space-time coordinate is nowhere never, meaning it doesn't exist. In fact, this is the most self-defeating argument I've ever heard," end quote. However, I disagree with Ravi's statement. That being, for something to exist, it must exist in space-time. For example, take tenseless propositions and properties to specific types of abstract objects. Without taking too much away from my upcoming series, on abstract objects as defeaters of physicalism, some abstract objects seem to exist outside of space and time, i.e. the aforementioned objects. Take properties, for example, specifically the property of sweetness. Suppose we have an apple and bite into it, and it tastes sweet. This property has 4 characteristics. Sweetness is universal, meaning that it's not constricted exclusively to the apple, but to the candy bar across the street, for example. It's immutable, meaning that the apple can rot and become disgusting, and aka not sweet, but it's the apple changing and not the property. The property is also dependent on substances. We don't run into sweetness lying on the table, for example, and this property has no causal power. It's not a causal agent. Indeed, if such abstract objects do in fact exist, then they provide an alternative to Ravi's statement. Moreover, the phrase in question seems to beg the question in favor of naturalism. After all, how does Ravi know that in order for something to exist, it must exist in space and time? God, if he exists, could very well be the exception to this rule. Thus, outside of an argument for such a statement, and given a contrary example, that being properties and tenseless propositions, it is safe to refuse such a claim, allowing the theist to hold to divine timelessness. Thus, it is safe to conclude that divine timelessness is not self-contradictory. In summation, I would like to reiterate that I'm not advocating divine timelessness, nor am I advocating divine temporality. If I were to be honest with you, I'm still studying such things and have not come to conclusion yet. However, the theist does have several options available to him to reject the 2 objections raised by Ravi and hold to either theory of eternality that is consistent with his views of time, divine simplicity, necessity, etc. Peace.